The video that would eventually be viewed over 47 million times began with what appeared to be an ordinary moment in one of Dubai's most exclusive restaurants. The footage, captured by multiple angles including security cameras and smartphone recordings from nearby tables, showed a woman in a modest navy dress being escorted to a private dining area on Christmas Eve. What the cameras recorded over the next 90 minutes would spark international headlines, inspire thousands of personal testimonies, and fundamentally alter the trajectory of two families separated by an ocean of wealth and circumstance. The woman's name was Elena Vasquez, and she had arrived at the Al Maktoum Grand Hotel, believing she was meeting a potential romantic connection arranged through a high-end matchmaking service. The man waiting for her was Khalid bin Rashid Al Farhan, whose family's oil and real estate holdings placed him among the 500 wealthiest individuals on the planet. But the most important person in the room wasn't either of them. She was 4 years old. She had been hiding under a tablecloth for the first 7 minutes of the encounter, and her name was Yasmin. The question she would eventually ask Elena, a question that would be replayed in news segments across 6 continents, would expose truths that her father had spent 3 years trying to bury and awaken possibilities that Elena had long ago surrendered. Elena Vasquez had not always worked as a pediatric oncology nurse at Cleveland Clinic, Abu Dhabi. Before the transfer that brought her to the Emirates 18 months earlier, she had spent 7 years at Johns Hopkins Children's Center in Baltimore, specializing in the care of terminally ill patients and their families. Her colleagues described her as someone who possessed an almost supernatural ability to connect with children facing unimaginable circumstances, a gift that had emerged from her own childhood in a small town in the Philippines, where her mother had died of leukemia when Elena was 9 years old. She understood, in ways that could not be taught in any nursing program, what it meant to be small and afraid and surrounded by adults who themselves were drowning in grief. She knew how to sit with that fear without trying to fix it, how to make a child laugh when laughter seemed impossible, how to hold a hand through the kind of darkness that most people couldn't imagine. Her transfer to Abu Dhabi had not been driven by career advancement or financial opportunity, though the position paid considerably more than her Baltimore salary. She had come because she needed distance from the memories that had accumulated in the hallways of Hopkins. Too many small faces, too many families she had walked with to the edge and then beyond. The grief had begun to calcify around her heart, and she had recognized, with the clinical clarity she applied to her patients, that she was approaching the point where she would no longer be able to do the work that defined her. Abu Dhabi offered a reset, a chance to rebuild her reserves of hope in a place where the memories could not find her. The matchmaking service that had arranged the Christmas Eve dinner was called Lux Connections, and it catered exclusively to clients whose net worth exceeded $50 million. Elena was not such a client. She had been referred to the service by a colleague whose husband worked in private wealth management, and she had been accepted into their database as a potential match, a designation given to women who possessed the qualities their male clients sought, but who could not afford the service's astronomical membership fees. Elena had found the entire concept distasteful when it was first explained to her. The clinical way the intake coordinator had assessed her appearance, her education, her family background, her presentation. She had nearly walked out of the initial interview when the woman asked her to rate her own attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 10. But something had made her stay. Perhaps the loneliness that had deepened during her first year in a foreign country. Perhaps the pragmatic recognition that she was 34 years old and had not been on a date in nearly 2 years. perhaps simply the curiosity about a world so different from her own. She had told herself she would give it one meeting, one dinner, one glimpse behind the curtain of extreme wealth. If it felt as hollow as she suspected it would, she would cancel her profile and return to the simpler rhythms of her life. Work, her small apartment in Al Reem Island, the weekend calls with her father in Manila, the patients who needed her. Khalid bin Rashid Al Farhan had joined Lux Connection 6 months after his wife's death, not because he was seeking romance, but because his family had demanded it. His father, the patriarch of the Al Farhan holdings, had made clear that the continuation of the family line was not optional. Khalid was 38 years old. He had one daughter, and his wife's death from a brain aneurysm had left him as the sole inheritor of his branch of the dynasty and the sole custodian of its future. The elder Al Farhan had given his son 18 months to grieve and then had begun the campaign of pressure that would eventually drive Khalid to the matchmaking service. Dinners with eligible women from appropriate families, introductions at charity events, suggestions that grew increasingly less subtle about the importance of providing Yasmin with siblings and the family with assurance. Khalid had joined Lux Connections not to find a wife, but to create the appearance of trying, to generate enough activity in his dating life that his father would relent. He had been on 14 such dinners in the previous 6 months, each one more perfunctory than the last. He had developed a system: arrive slightly late, establish early that his schedule was demanding, ask enough questions to appear engaged while revealing nothing meaningful about himself, and conclude the evening within 90 minutes with vague promises of future contact that he had no intention of keeping. The women he met were invariably beautiful, accomplished, and eager, qualities that had begun to feel interchangeable and therefore meaningless. He did not want to marry any of them. He was not certain he wanted to marry anyone ever again. The Al Maktoum Grand Hotel's private dining room on the 47th floor was designed to communicate wealth without vulgarity, exclusivity without ostentation. The walls were lined with hand-carved panels of Lebanese cedar. The floors were Italian marble in a pale rose that absorbed sound and light in equal measure, and the windows offered an unobstructed view of the Arabian Gulf, where the lights of passing ships created a second constellation below the stars. The table had been set for 2, with baccarat crystal and Bernadotte porcelain and fresh flowers that had been flown in that morning from a private greenhouse in the Netherlands. The sommelier had already decanted a bottle of 1990 Chateau Margaux, having been informed of Khalid's preferences by the matchmaking service's concierge. The chef, who had trained under Alain Ducasse in Paris, had prepared a 7-course menu that balanced French technique with local ingredients, each dish designed to impress without overwhelming, to demonstrate refinement without appearing to try. Everything had been arranged to facilitate the precise kind of evening that Khalid had experienced a dozen times before: pleasant, forgettable, and concluded by 10 o'clock. What had not been arranged was the presence of Yasmin, who had convinced her nanny that she was asleep in the hotel suite 1 floor below, and had then navigated the service elevator with the help of a housekeeping employee who had no idea he was facilitating what would become international news. Yasmin had learned about the dinner from overhearing her father's phone conversation with his assistant, and she had decided, with the fierce determination that characterized everything she did, that she needed to see for herself the woman her father was meeting. Her mother had been dead for 3 years, which represented most of Yasmin's conscious memory. She had photographs and videos and stories told by relatives, but her actual recollections were fragmented. A scent, a sound, a feeling of warmth that she could not quite locate in space or time. What she understood with perfect clarity was that her father was sad in a way that he tried to hide from her, and that the sadness was connected to the absence of her mother, and that other children had mothers who were present and alive and who did things that Yasmin had to imagine or reconstruct from media depictions of maternal love. She had not told anyone about her plan to observe the dinner because she knew it would be forbidden. She was 4 years old, and she had already learned that the most important things often required secrecy. Elena arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, having been escorted from the lobby by a hotel employee whose deference suggested she was someone of consequence rather than a nurse earning a comfortable but hardly exceptional salary. She wore a dress she had purchased for the occasion after 3 hours of agonizing deliberation at the Dubai Mall. Navy blue, modest in cut, but elegant in construction. The most expensive garment she had ever owned at $472. Her jewelry was minimal. Small gold earrings that had belonged to her mother. A thin bracelet purchased at a street market in Manila the last time she visited her father. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her makeup was understated in a way that required more skill than anything dramatic would have. She had spent an hour getting ready, and then another 20 minutes trying to talk herself out of going at all. And then another 15 minutes reminding herself that this was just dinner, just curiosity, just one evening that would probably be unremarkable and forgotten within a week. She had not expected to be nervous, but as the elevator rose toward the 47th floor, she felt the familiar flutter in her chest that preceded moments of significance. The same sensation she experienced before delivering difficult news to parents, before entering the room of a patient she knew would not survive the night, before every threshold that divided one phase of life from another. Khalid had arrived 12 minutes early, a departure from his usual protocol of strategic lateness. He had told himself this was merely efficient, that he had business calls to make before the dinner, and the hotel's private dining room offered better connectivity than his car. But some part of him, some subterranean awareness that he refused to examine directly, had noted Elena's photograph in the matchmaking profile and had felt something he had not felt in the 14 previous encounters. Curiosity. She was not the most beautiful woman he had been matched with. That distinction belonged to a Swedish model whose symmetry had seemed almost algorithmic, but there was something in her eyes that suggested depths he could not immediately categorize. Her profile had listed her occupation as healthcare professional, which was deliberately vague, and her interests as reading, children's advocacy, and long walks that go nowhere in particular, which was either charmingly honest or strategically calculated to seem so. Khalid had built a fortune on his ability to read people, to identify the gap between presentation and reality, to see through the careful constructions that wealth attracted like moths to flame. He could not read Elena's photograph. This irritated him, and irritation was more interesting than the indifference he usually felt. The first 7 minutes of the dinner followed the pattern Khalid had established across his previous encounters. He stood when Elena entered, offered a professionally warm greeting, guided her to the table with a hand that did not quite touch her back, and began the ritualized exchange of pleasantries that would establish the parameters of the evening. Elena responded with appropriate formality, her voice steady despite the surroundings that clearly exceeded anything in her normal experience. She did not comment on the view or the wine or the obvious expense of the setting. which Khalid noted as either remarkable self-possession or determined performance. She asked about his work, and he gave his standard evasive answer about investments and family enterprises. She described her position as a nurse, which she had already disclosed in her profile, and he asked what had brought her to Abu Dhabi, a question designed to elicit either the ambitious truth or the diplomatic fiction that such conversations typically produced. She told him about burnout and grief and the need to rebuild her capacity for hope, and the directness of her answer was so unexpected that he did not immediately know how to respond. For a moment, perhaps 15 seconds, the scripted quality of the evening wavered and something authentic threatened to emerge. It was at this point that Yasmin emerged from beneath the tablecloth, where she had been waiting since before Elena's arrival, her small body pressed against the cedar paneling of the booth's interior, her breathing controlled with a discipline remarkable for her age. She had intended to remain hidden for the entire dinner, observing without being observed. But Elena's answer to her father's question had triggered something in the child that she could not suppress. She knew about grief. She knew about missing someone so much that you felt like you might disappear into the absence they left behind. She had never heard an adult talk about it with the simple directness that Elena had just demonstrated, without the careful packaging that grown-ups usually applied to difficult truths when they thought children might be listening. Yasmin crawled out from under the tablecloth, her designer dress now rumpled and her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins, and she stood beside the table looking at Elena with an intensity that would later be analyzed by millions of viewers trying to understand what had passed between them in that moment. Kali's reaction was immediate and sharp. He reached for Yasmin with a movement that contained equal parts concern and embarrassment, apologizing to Elena while simultaneously demanding to know how his daughter had gotten here and where her nanny was. His voice, which had been modulated and careful throughout the dinner's opening minutes, now carried an edge that revealed emotions he usually kept subterranean: fear, frustration, and something that Elena recognized immediately as shame. He was ashamed of his daughter's presence. He was ashamed that Elena was seeing this disruption of the careful performance he had constructed. And Elena, watching the child shrink slightly under her father's reaction, felt something shift in her chest. A protective instinct so powerful that it overrode every social calculation she might otherwise have made. She did something that would be described in subsequent media coverage as the first turning point of the evening. She ignored Khalid entirely and spoke directly to Yasmin, asking her name and whether she would like to sit down. The child's response was to climb onto the booth beside Elena without waiting for permission, her small body pressing against Elena's side as if seeking warmth. Khalid continued his interrogation. How had she gotten here? Who had helped her? Did she understand how dangerous it was to wander a hotel alone? But Yasmin did not acknowledge him. She was looking at Elena with an expression that would later be described by child psychologists as intense attachment seeking, but which Elena simply recognized as loneliness. Profound, bottomless loneliness of the kind that no amount of wealth or nannies or private tutors could address. Elena had seen that loneliness in the eyes of children facing terminal diagnoses, children whose parents were too consumed by their own grief to provide adequate comfort, children who understood that the adults around them were failing at the one task that mattered. She had never seen it quite so nakedly in a child who was, by all external measures, privileged beyond imagination. "Your dress is a pretty color," Yasmin said to Elena, her voice small but clear. My mama liked blue. Did you know that blue is the color of the sky and also the ocean? That's because of something called refraction. My tutor told me. Elena smiled. That's very scientific of you. Do you like learning about science? I like learning about everything, Yasmin said, but my favorite thing to learn about is animals. Did you know that elephants mourn their dead? She glanced at her father for the first time since emerging from her hiding place, like people do. Khalid had stopped speaking. He stood beside the table, his hands still extended toward his daughter, frozen in a posture of interrupted authority. The shift that had occurred in the room was palpable, a transfer of emotional gravity from him to the connection forming between Elena and his daughter. He watched Elena lean down to Yasmin's level and ask about her favorite animals. Watched his daughter's face transform from the guarded watchfulness she usually maintained around strangers to something approaching joy. And he felt himself becoming peripheral to a conversation that should not be happening at all. He should interrupt. He should summon the nanny. He should reassert control over an evening that had deviated catastrophically from its intended script. But something held him in place. Perhaps the same curiosity that had made him arrive early, or perhaps something older and more frightening. The recognition that his daughter needed something he could not provide, and that this woman he had just met might somehow possess it. The next 20 minutes of the dinner would later be reconstructed from the security footage and from the testimony of waitstaff who observed through the service entrance, their professional detachment gradually giving way to fascination. Elena and Yasmin talked about elephants and grief and the difference between sadness that comes and goes and sadness that takes up residence. They talked about Yasmin's mother, a subject that Khalid had carefully avoided for 3 years, preferring to let professionals handle the therapeutic dimensions of his daughter's loss. Elena asked questions that Khalid had never thought to ask. What did Yasmin miss most? What did she wish people understood? What did she do when the missing became too big to carry? Yasmin answered with the devastating honesty of childhood, describing how she sometimes talked to her mother's photograph, how she had hidden one of her mother's scarves under her pillow, how she didn't like it when people told her that her mother was in a better place because the better place should be here, with her. Elena listened without trying to fix or redirect, without offering platitudes or false comfort, and Khalid watched his daughter open like a flower that had been waiting 3 years for rain. Khalid eventually sat down, not in his original seat across from Elena, but in a chair pulled to the side, positioning himself as observer rather than participant. He had never seen his daughter speak so freely, so openly, so without the careful self-monitoring that she had developed in the years since her mother's death. The child who navigated their household with preternatural diplomacy, who seemed always to be calculating the emotional weather and adjusting her behavior accordingly, who laughed when laughing was expected and remained silent when silence was required. That child had been replaced by someone raw and real and terrifyingly vulnerable. He did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. Elena, he said, using her name for the first time, I should apologize for this disruption. Yasmin knows better than to. She knows exactly what she needed, Elena interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. And she came to find it. That's not a disruption. That's courage. The remainder of the dinner proceeded in a configuration that none of its participants had anticipated. Khalid ordered food for Yasmin from the children's menu, abandoning the 7-course tasting experience that the chef had prepared. Elena declined the wine that had been decanted and asked for tea instead, sharing a cup with Yasmin, who declared it too leafy but nice. The conversation expanded to include Khalid, though he found himself speaking less than listening, watching the ease with which Elena engaged his daughter and feeling something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. He learned that Elena had lost her own mother young, that she worked with children who were dying, that she had come to Abu Dhabi to escape memories that had become too heavy to carry. He learned that she was not impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his status, that she asked questions that no one in his circle would think to ask, that she laughed at Yasmin's jokes with genuine delight, rather than the performative appreciation his daughter usually received from adults. He began to understand why his daughter had risked punishment to observe this woman, and he began to feel something he had not felt since his wife's death. The possibility of possibility. What happened next became the centerpiece of the viral video. The moment that would be replayed and analyzed and set to music by content creators around the world. It was approximately 9:15 in the evening, and Yasmin had been fighting sleep for 20 minutes, her head occasionally drooping before she forced herself upright. Elena had asked her if she wanted to rest, and Yasmin had shaken her head with fierce determination, apparently unwilling to miss a moment of this unexpected evening. But fatigue eventually won, and she found herself leaning against Elena's side, her eyes closing despite her best efforts. In the moment before sleep fully claimed her, she looked up at Elena and asked the question that would change everything. "Can you be my new mom? I promise I would be really good and I wouldn't hide under tables anymore, and I would eat my vegetables, even the green ones." She paused, her 4-year-old mind clearly working through logistics. "My dad is very rich, so he could pay you a lot to be my mom. Would $1 million be enough?" I heard him say that once about something he bought. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though viewers of the security footage would swear it was longer. Elena's face underwent a sequence of expressions that body language experts would later identify as surprise, heartbreak, tenderness, and something that resisted clinical categorization. She did not look at Khalid, did not check his reaction, or seek his guidance for how to respond. She looked only at Yasmin, this child who had just offered her entire heart in the most transactional terms she knew how to express. "Sweet girl," Elena said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. "You don't need to pay anyone to love you, and you don't need to be good or hide or eat vegetables you don't like. You just need to be exactly who you are." She brushed a strand of hair from Yasmin's face, a gesture so maternal that several of the waitstaff watching would later describe it as the moment they began to cry. Being someone's mom isn't something you buy. It's something that grows, like those flowers you probably have in your garden. And it takes time, and it takes getting to know each other. And it takes a lot of things that can't happen in one dinner. Yasmin's response was immediate. "But will you try? To be my mom, I mean. Will you at least try?" Elena finally looked at Khalid, and something passed between them that neither would later be able to articulate. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that whatever this evening had been intended to be, it had become something else entirely. That the careful performances they had both prepared had been rendered irrelevant by a 4-year-old's desperate hope. That they were standing at a threshold that neither had expected to encounter, and the only possible responses were to retreat or to step through. "I think Elena said carefully, looking back at Yasmin, that your father and I should probably have some conversations about that. Grown-up conversations that are very boring and take a long time. But conversations that end with yes, Yasmin pressed. Conversations that start with possibility, Elena said. And that's the best kind of start there is. Khalid bin Rashid Al Farhan had built his career on the ability to identify leverage, to understand what people wanted, and to calculate how that wanting could be directed toward mutually beneficial outcomes. He had negotiated deals worth billions of dollars, had outmaneuvered competitors who had underestimated his intelligence and his patience, had learned from his father and grandfather the subtle art of making others believe that his desires were their own ideas. None of that preparation had equipped him for the leverage his daughter had just created, not against him, but for him, on his behalf, without his knowledge or consent. She had cut through months of careful matchmaking and social positioning and strategic ambiguity with a single question that exposed the core of what he needed and had been too protected to seek. He did not want a suitable wife from an appropriate family. He did not want a strategic partnership dressed in romance. He wanted someone who could see his daughter, truly see her, not as an heir or an obligation or a charming accessory to wealth, but as the struggling, brilliant, grieving human she was. And in the space of 90 minutes, Elena Vasquez had demonstrated exactly that capacity. The conclusion of the dinner was photographed by other guests who had noticed the unusual configuration at the private table. A nurse in a modest dress, a billionaire looking uncertain for perhaps the first time in his adult life, and a small child asleep against the nurse's shoulder. The images would be posted to social media within the hour, initially without context, sparking speculation that ranged from kidnapping theories to assumptions about mistresses and secret families. The truth would emerge gradually over the following days, pieced together by journalists who tracked down the Lux Connection service, by former colleagues of Elena's who recognized her in the photographs, by household staff who spoke anonymously about Yasmin's escalating loneliness in the months before the dinner. By the time the full story was assembled, it had already acquired the dimensions of myth. The lonely princess, the unexpected visitor, the question that revealed what money could not buy. What the public did not see was what happened after the photographs were taken, after Khalid carried his sleeping daughter to the suite 1 floor below, after Elena gathered her modest purse and prepared to return to her apartment across the city. Khalid asked her to wait, to stay while he settled Yasmin, to have one more conversation without the presence of his daughter shaping every word. Elena waited. She stood at the window of the private dining room, looking out at the lights of Dubai spreading to the horizon, and she thought about the children she had lost at Hopkins, the ones whose names she still whispered in the dark moments before sleep. She thought about her mother, dead now for 25 years, still present in the small gold earrings Elena wore, and in the way Elena listened to frightened children, and in the ache that never fully subsided. She thought about Yasmin's question, the impossible, heartbreaking simplicity of it, and she understood that she was being offered something she had never expected to find. A second chance at a life she had stopped believing was possible. Khalid returned 40 minutes later, having answered questions from a frantic nanny, having explained to his security chief how his daughter had bypassed multiple protocols, having sat for 10 minutes beside Yasmin's bed watching her sleep with a peace she rarely showed while awake. He found Elena still at the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. And he stood beside her without speaking for several long breaths. "I need to tell you something," he finally said. "Something I haven't told the matchmaking service or my family or anyone who might use it to judge whether we should proceed." Elena turned to face him, her expression open but wary. "I don't know how to love anyone anymore. Since Amira died, I felt like that capacity just evaporated. I go through the motions with Yasmin. I provide everything she needs, but I don't feel it the way I should, the way I used to. I see her looking for something in my eyes, and I can't give it to her, and every day I fail at the only thing that matters." He paused, his voice cracking. "I'm telling you this because you should know who you're dealing with. Not the profile, not the reputation. The man who loved his wife and lost her and doesn't know if he has anything left to offer anyone." Elena's response would later be quoted in news coverage of their story, though neither of them knew at the time that their conversation was being captured by a security camera, whose footage would eventually be subpoenaed and leaked. "I work with children who are dying," she said. "Every day, I walk into rooms where love is the only thing left, where everything else has been stripped away, and love is still there. Stubborn and painful, and so present it fills every molecule of air." She took a breath. "What you're describing isn't the absence of love. It's love that's been traumatized. Love that learned to protect itself by going numb. That's not empty. That's wounded. And wounded things can heal." She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture so simple that its significance could only be measured by its context. "I'm not in any position to promise you anything. I don't know you. I don't know your daughter beyond what I saw tonight. But I know this. That child needs someone who can see her. And tonight, she saw me seeing her. That's not nothing. That's a start." The weeks that followed the Christmas Eve dinner would be documented by media outlets whose coverage ranged from respectful to invasive. Khalid and Elena met again, this time without Yasmin, at a coffee shop Elena chose, a deliberate move away from the rarefied atmosphere of their first encounter. They talked for 4 hours about grief and loss, about Elena's mother and Khalid's wife, about the ways that caring for others could become a substitute for caring for oneself. They met again at Elena's hospital, where she gave him a tour that carefully avoided patient areas, showing him the playroom she had designed for children undergoing chemotherapy, the garden where families could sit together away from the clinical environment. He watched her interact with colleagues and saw the respect she commanded. The way her presence seemed to calm the barely contained chaos of a pediatric oncology unit. He began to understand that her tenderness with Yasmin was not performance, but practice, not calculation, but calling. Yasmin asked about Elena daily, with an intensity that concerned the child psychologist who had been managing her grief process for 2 years. The psychologist warned Khalid about attachment, about the risk of building expectations that might not be fulfilled, about the complexity of introducing new maternal figures to a child still processing loss. Khalid listened, and then he asked Elena to have dinner with them, not at a hotel or a restaurant, but at his home, a penthouse apartment where Yasmin's presence would not be a disruption, but a given. Elena said yes. The dinner was awkward at first, Yasmin's excitement creating pressure that made normal conversation difficult. But midway through the meal, Yasmin asked Elena if she wanted to see her room, and Elena spent the next hour looking at toys and books, and eventually, the hidden scarf that still smelled faintly of Amira's perfume. Sometimes I worry I'll forget what she smelled like, Yasmin confessed, holding the scarf to her face. Sometimes I already can't remember. Then we'll make sure you have things that help you remember, Elena said. We'll take care of the memories together. So even when they get hard to reach, they'll still be there. 6 months after the Christmas Eve dinner, Khalid bin Rashid Al Farhan did something that generated headlines and financial publications around the world. He stepped back from active management of the family's holdings, delegating operational control to a trusted deputy while retaining his ownership stake and board position. The financial press interpreted this as a strategic retreat, perhaps a response to market pressures or family tensions. Those closer to the situation understood it differently. Khalid had made a decision about what kind of father he wanted to be, and that decision required presence, physical, emotional, daily presence that his previous schedule had not permitted. He began picking Yasmin up from school himself, sitting through performances and recitals that he had previously attended via video link, taking weekend trips to places Yasmin chose from books and documentaries. Elena was present for many of these experiences, her role in their lives evolving from guest to fixture to something that resisted easy categorization. She did not move in with them. She did not stop working, but she was there, reliably and consistently there, in a way that Yasmin had not experienced since her mother's death. The wedding, when it eventually occurred 14 months after that first dinner, was modest by the standards of the Al Farhan family. Only 300 guests, held at a botanical garden that Yasmin had selected after an exhaustive review of possible venues. Yasmin served as flower girl and ring bearer, and, in a departure from tradition that she had negotiated fiercely, delivered a brief speech during the reception. My mom, my first mom, is not here, she said, her voice amplified by a microphone that nearly overwhelmed her small frame. But I think she sent Elena to us because she knew we needed someone, and she found the exact right person. She looked at Elena, who was crying openly, and at her father, whose eyes glistened with tears he was not trying to hide. Thank you for coming when she called you. Thank you for saying yes to conversations that start with possibility. Thank you for being my new mom, even though I promised I'd be good and eat vegetables, and I still don't like broccoli. The video of that speech would be shared even more widely than the Christmas Eve footage, accumulating views that surpassed 100 million across platforms. Comment sections filled with stories of blended families, of grief transformed by unexpected love, of children who had found their voices, and adults who had found their courage. Charitable donations to pediatric oncology programs surged in the weeks following the wedding, with many donors citing Elena's work as inspiration. Lux Connections, the matchmaking service that had facilitated the initial connection, reported a 300% increase in applications from individuals explicitly seeking meaningful connection rather than strategic partnership. The Al Farhan family, initially skeptical of Elena's background and uncertain about the rapid development of the relationship, had been won over by watching Yasmin's transformation, the return of her laughter, the confidence that replaced her hypervigilance, the simple normalcy of a child who knew she was loved. 5 years after that Christmas Eve dinner, Elena Vasquez Al Farhan remained in her position at Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, having declined multiple offers to transition into charitable foundation work that would have been less demanding and more socially appropriate for her station. She continued to care for children who were dying, continued to sit with families at the worst moments of their lives, continued to believe that presence was the most valuable thing one human could offer another. Khalid had returned to more active involvement in the family business, though his schedule remained structured around his daughter's needs. And Yasmin, now 9 years old, had begun volunteering at her stepmother's hospital, reading to patients, bringing them drawings, offering the particular comfort that only someone who understood loss could provide. She still kept her mother's scarf under her pillow, though its scent had long since faded. "It doesn't matter," she told Elena when they discussed it. "The smell isn't the memory. The smell is just how the memory used to find me. Now I have other ways." The story that had begun with a child hiding under a tablecloth and asking a stranger to be her mother had evolved into something both more ordinary and more remarkable. A family, imperfect and assembled and deeply, stubbornly committed to one another. The viral videos and news coverage had faded, replaced by newer sensations and more recent scandals. But the lesson of that Christmas Eve remained, repeated in testimonials from viewers whose lives had been changed by witnessing it. You cannot buy love, but love, like Yasmin had intuited with her 4-year-old wisdom, could sometimes be invited. It could be offered possibility. It could be given the space to grow. And when it did grow, when it took root in the most unlikely circumstances, it could transform not just the people involved, but everyone who witnessed its improbable flowering. Elena still had the navy dress, though it no longer fit and had gone out of style years ago. She kept it in her closet as a reminder of the evening she had almost talked herself out of, the evening that had given her everything she had stopped believing she deserved. Possibility, it turned out, was not just the best kind of start. It was also, somehow, enough.